Nick.
Here we go. I'm here.
Hello. Yes.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi,
How are
Nick.
you?
Very
Hey,
well. It's wonderful to
very
have
good.
you here.
Thank you so much.
I was just sending a message saying, "Where's Nick?" And here you are.
I was here. Yes, I was waiting. I was just waiting in queue, but no, I'm here now. All good.
Marvelous. Well, thank you so much. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to everyone Nick Cooper. Nick is just the most you're a real vine geek, can I say, the most really committed, passionate viticulturalist. I've so enjoyed all of our chats and kind of both in preparation for this conference, but in general. And I know that you've really championed a project at Mount Pleasant to really research and get into the kind of the impact, the story, and the value of some of your old vineyards. You have some amazing old vineyards, but I think it's fair to say that it's relatively recently that there's been the resource and the input into really looking at them and understanding them and pinning down their history and their relevance. So I'm sure that everyone's going to really enjoy hearing from you. And I was saying just before you joined, Nick, that if anyone has any requests for further information or would like to know more about your research project, I'm sure that you'd be delighted to help them. So
Yeah, of course.
right, well, I'm going to pass over to you and
Sure.
thank you, and see you in a few minutes.
No worries. Thank you, Sarah. Well, thank you everyone for joining in and tuning in for this fifth Old Vine Conference. And as Sarah had said, over the last 2 years or so, we've been involved with Belinda and Sarah here at Mount Pleasant, talking about what we have in terms of old vine stocks, of which we've got a lot, 50 hectares under vine now at Mount Pleasant, and pretty much half of that, so 25 hectares of that are over 50 years old. 58 years old is the youngest of what we consider the old blocks. But in particular, and I'll share my screen and the presentation I've put together, but in particular, the focus has been on the Pinot block that we have. So the block right out the front, as you can see with this picture here, so that's a picture looking from one of the main roads through the Hunter Valley, looking up towards the cellar door and the winery behind at Mount Pleasant. And that block you can just see in the front is the Pinot block, which I'll speak about tonight. So that's a block of vines, a fairly small block of vines, but it's a block of vines planted in 1921, Pinot Noir planted in 1921. So what I'll do is I'll work through this list, which is a bit of a format for the presentation. So I'll look at Pinot Noir in Australia, what we believe were the origins of that variety in Australia, when it turned up and where it's gone from there. I'll then touch on Maurice O'Shea, who was the founder of Mount Pleasant back in 1921, and he's considered Australia's sort of first great winemaker. So this is, the name is carried through to now, and we continue his legacy. I'll then touch upon that block, the Mother Vine Pinot Noir block, and then the project that we did on those vines. So that will then probably make up most of the presentation, is the testing of the vines, the project, and then from there, what we learned from that project and what we do with this information, because it is pretty fascinating for a wine geek like myself, like Sarah said. So what I'll do is we'll crack into it. So as I said, the first thing I thought we'd cover is Pinot Noir generally. So I think we'd all know that Pinot Noir is the great red grape of both Burgundy and Champagne. Obviously, Champagne is part of Fizz, and then Burgundy is a standalone red wine. And in terms of its history, I think 4th century AD is often referenced, but it can be even earlier than that. I've found a lot of information on records predating 4th century as well. A variety that's very volatile genetically, and it has thrown, obviously, skin mutations over the years, which have gone on to become Pinot Gris or Grigio, Pinot Blanc, and Pinot Meunier. And then obviously we've got the massive clones that exist. So there's hundreds to thousands, up to 2,000, I believe, some people would say, of clones. But here in Australia, we're generally growing around 20, give or take. its history in Australia is interesting too. So James Busby is a name that a lot of people would recognise that know Australian wine. So he's the man that's referenced as being the founder of the Australian wine, maybe not wine scene, but the wine culture, viticulture in particular. So he was sent over in 1831 to go and collect the great vineyard or vine cuttings from some of the great vineyards in Europe. And while he was over there in 1831, he's taken cuttings, as the story goes, he's taken cuttings from Clos de Vougeot in Burgundy and then brought those back as the Pinot cuttings and planted them in his father's vineyard. So his father, James's father, John Busby, had a land grant in the Hunter Valley and had a vineyard called Kirkton. And so James, when he returned from his European sojourn, he planted these cuttings in that vineyard. And then from there, the cuttings have moved through the Hunter Valley and ended up in Mount Pleasant, which I'll get to. But 1832 is not only the only it's early, obviously, but there's been some other grapevine material coming into Australia, in particular in Victoria, in the 1840s and 50s with some Swiss migrants. And today, Pinot Noir, it is the number 4 red grape in terms of vineyard area planted out in Australia, and it's only 3% of the crush. So it's only a small amount. You can think that Shiraz and Cabernet make up the great part of that. But Pinot Noir is on the rise, in particular in the cooler climates of Australia. So whether that is elevated sites, which we have here in New South Wales, areas like Tumbarumba and Orange, and this is probably the more common, going south. So Tasmania is the real hotbed for Pinot Noir at the moment. And then you've got areas like the Yarra Valley, Mornington Peninsula, Adelaide Hills, Gippsland, Macedon, and Pemberton's over in WA, but all southern regions where that due to that southern latitude, cooler climates, Pinot Noir has that gentle ripening curve and goes on to probably make the more famous wines from Australia from Pinot. And obviously, in the Hunter Valley, it's not particularly a cool region, but again, we'll get into the significance of the Hunter Valley. So Mount Pleasant, 1921, was established by Maurice O'Shea, and as I said, considered the first great winemaker in Australia. He's over in France studying viticulture and enology and teaching a bit over there as well. And then at 24 years of age, he comes back to Australia, born in Australia, but he's come back to Australia after his time over in France and convinces his mother to buy the King's property, which is where we sit on. And in this picture behind me, that's looking up towards the old hill block, which is what is the block that the Kings had on the property when Maurice's family took over. So that was 1880. We have a block of Shiraz called the Old Hill, 3.1 hectares, and that was planted by the Kings. The O'Sheas come in, they buy that property, they inherit that King planting of Shiraz, and it doesn't take Maurice too long to start to establish his own vineyards within that property. So the two plantings in 1921 are the Old Paddock Shiraz, and then obviously the Mother Vine Pinot, which is the focus of tonight. And you can see 0.58 head of a hectare. So it's, acre and a half. It's a small block right at the front of the property. As I said, cuttings, we believe Maurice has taken his cuttings from a man called James King, who had a vineyard called Irrawang, again in the Hunter Valley, in the upper Hunter Valley. And those cuttings were taken from there, but the Irrawang planting were cuttings taken from this vineyard I referenced before, Kirkton. So owned by the Busbys, managed by the Kelmans. So these cuttings have passed through a few hands until Maurice gets his hands on them in 1921. But they've been in Australia at that point for almost 90 years, these cuttings, or Pinot Noir itself, and the cuttings have come from there. There is, I did read the rumour of the gumboot story, which is the Abel clone story in New Zealand, which is that grapevine cuttings were smuggled into New Zealand. I believe that story is true. But the O'Shea story of him doing it, it doesn't seem to be true. I did see a little bit out there, but it looks as though Maurice has done the right thing and just taken cuttings and continued the Pinot legacy there. So yeah, 1921, Maurice plants this block of Pinot Noir out the front of his winery at Mount Pleasant. 40 years later, we have Graham Gregory, who was the viticulturist for New South Wales Agriculture at the time for the Department of Primary Industries. He's obviously noticed something in this block, something that he likes, whether it was the age of the vines at this point, around 40 years old, or whether it was the wines that they were going on to make, or it was the way that the vines seem to handle the conditions in the hunter really, really well. But he has picked this block out and he's taken cuttings from this 1921 planting and taken them to the Griffith Viticultural Research Station and started to propagate these cuttings out. After his work in 1971, the clone Mother Vine 6 or MV6 is released to the Australian wine industry as a Pinot Noir clone. And this is a real pivotal moment because it's the establishment of Australia's heritage Pinot Noir clone. So this time, up to this point, there were the Pinot Noir that was there, it probably had different names. Farmers probably referenced it in certain ways, but it hadn't been labelled, it hadn't been identified as such or propagated to the point where people could come and buy for their own vineyards this genetic line. So MV6 is what it's called. There is in existence MV4 and 5, and apparently even MV1, 2, and 3, and they might have gone on from there. But the one that seems to have, the one that does or has carried through is MV6. The other Mother Vine clones are out there. The Yarra Valley claims to have some MV4 and 5, and they quite possibly do. But the distinction between them and MV6 hasn't been clarified yet, due to the lack of access to material, MV4 and MV5 material, that this project, which I'll talk about, is able to look at. So MV6 is picked, it's propagated, and now today it is Australia's most widely planted Pinot Noir clone. So it is the backbone of the Australian Pinot Noir industry across the nation. Mid to late ripening, small bunches, thick skins, generally low yields, but very high quality. Our planting here, original planting was planted on rootstock, so Vitis labrusca, and a lot of that would have been based on Morris seeing the impact of phylloxera over in Europe while he was over there studying, and also that there was phylloxera actually around Sydney, in the Sydney Basin at the time. So he's gone on American rootstock for phylloxera resistance way before nurseries were propagating vineyards and doing the scion rootstock combination. And just quickly, the planting itself, as I said, 0.58 of a hectare, planted in 1921, and it tends to average over the last 12, 13 years, it's about 4.4 tonnes to the hectare. And we have two other blocks of MV6 on the property as well, a block planted in 88 and a block planted in 2014. One on rootstock and then one on own roots. And I've actually got those sizes mixed up. So the 9088 is actually 1.21. So the project, so what happened here is MV6 in particular, Pinot, has sort of followed me through my short career, or I've followed it, I don't know. But everywhere I've worked, Adelaide, Victoria, Tasmania, and now the Hunter Valley, I've been growing Pinot Noir. I've been involved in growing Pinot Noir, and particularly the MV6 clone. Turns out that I'm now in the place that is considered the birthplace of it, so it's fantastic. This project's all come together through a connection that I had with Prue Henschke, and I did a very small stint with Henschke in the Barossa back in 2015-16. So I knew Prue for a little while, and it just so happened at the time, 2020, there was major bushfires in the Adelaide Hills, which wiped out a lot of the source blocks, clonal blocks, for a few different varieties, but in particular Pinot Noir. So the Adelaide Hills Vine Improvement Program were using these source blocks to send propagation material out to other growers, even around Australia, and they lost a lot. At that same time, or just before that, it happened in 2019, 2020, Dr. Anthony Borman, who's been a big part of this project, he had just been working on a Chardonnay project using genome sequencing, a novel approach to identifying plant material. He had just finished in 2018 his Chardonnay genetic material sequencing project, and knew Prue, and Prue and Anthony got in touch, and so therefore the AWRI, which is the Australian Wine Research Institute, this new technique combined with the loss of these source blocks for the Adelaide Hills Vine Improvement Program, they paired up and they got together, and Anthony's genome sequencing technique was able to start to source and sequence out what clones that they still had access to and what clones existed in the Adelaide Hills, so they could work out if there are alternative source blocks. I'd contacted Prue about actually visiting Henschke when Adrian, myself, and Belinda, my colleague in Mount Pleasant, we were visiting Adelaide for Wine Tech. And Prue had put us in contact, or put me in contact with Anthony. So I met him there at Wine Tech 2022 in Adelaide. And when he found out that I was at Mount Pleasant, he said, well, we believe that Mount Pleasant has the original MV6 Pinot Noir. Would you be interested in helping us and taking some leaf samples for us to test to see what clonal material you actually do have in that block. So really, and we were laughing about it today, Anthony and I've played very little role in this. Essentially, I've been led along to this point, and I was requested to go and take some leaf samples from this old block, which I did. We picked 12 indicative vines, some of the vines that looked to be most established, the oldest vines in the block. I took some young leaf material, collected it, labelled the vines, sent it away, and then they hit a lab. At the lab, they were crushed, liquefied, and then essentially Anthony's then sent a huge database of genomes, and then it's his job with his team to put together the genomes and rebuild these data sets and map them genetically. It makes more sense on the next slide. It looks complicated, but I'll run you through it. Well, essentially what it is it's a circular tree diagram. If you consider that at the center of that diagram, right in the middle of that tree, would be the ancestral Pinot Noir vine of all Pinot Noir vines. And I'm talking pre-Pinot Gris and Blanc skin mutation, pre or clonal selection. Right in the middle is the ancestral Pinot Noir vine. As you move your way out, you start to become more and more specific in terms of, and in this case, in this tree, clonal material. So the graph here, you have the grey dots around the northern part of the graph. They are all the other clones that were tested as part of this project with Anthony, so the genome sequencing. And so there's some clones there that are reasonably common in Australia, 777, which is a Dijon clone, D5V12, which is a UC Davis clone. What else have we got? D2V5, another Davis clone, 115, another Dijon clone. And then what's highlighted on the graph is this blue wedge, and the blue wedge is the MV6 clade. So one thing to note is that MV6 is genetically totally differs to any other of these other clones. So it does sit off on its own branch. So it's a distinct clone. It's not a clone or a variation of something we've imported. It's something that is developed here. The blue dots are the samples that they had as part of the program from the Adelaide Hills vine improvement. So you can see that on either side of that blue shaded area are the data set that they had already from the Adelaide Hills material. And then the green dots are what we've taken. So the 12 vines that we sampled on that graph show up as heritage, and they're linked with each of these green dots, and they sit snug in that MV6 clade. Within that too, there's a grey dot, another grey dot that says Mount Pleasant. That Mount Pleasant clone is something that CSIRO have got. So that's the Commonwealth Science governing body. And they have this clone and have had it for a while called Mount Pleasant. They do not know where they've got it from. I'm assuming it's probably somewhere along the Graham Gregory line around that time, and they've had it in the collection, or cuttings have been moved across. But you can see that it falls neatly in the MV6 clade. And so therefore that whole blue arc, as we see highlighted, is all considered MV6 Pinot Noir. So if you combine, well, first, before I go on and make any statements based on that graph, we need to acknowledge the work that the AWRI did as well. And like I said, they did most of the work. I really just walked around and collected leaves. So the AWRI team is Christobella Neto, Chris Ward, Steve Vanden Heuvel, and then Anthony Borman. And Anthony's been my main contact through this process. And of course, all the collaborators supplying grapevine clonal material to the AWRI. And that's all it was volunteering. You know, it was just interesting. It'd be interesting for them to know what we had, and also it's very interesting to know what we had. So when you consider that there's a well-worn and really good information on the fact that this planting that we have at Mount Pleasant is from 1921. It is a Maurice O'Shea planting. It is Pinot Noir. We have photographic evidence, maybe not back to 1921, but into the 40s, 50s of that block being there, and a lot of written records of Maurice using Pinot throughout his career as a blending component, which would have been from that block. So what we've been able to deduce, and I made sure that I ran these ideas that I've taken out of this project. I've ran them past some of the invested parties, in particular Dr. Anthony, to make sure that they were truthful statements or as close as possible. And one thing, well, there's a few things we can say. The first is we can say now that really Mount Pleasant is the single, or the oldest single variety, single clone Pinot Noir vineyard in Australia. So though that data that I showed you on that graph doesn't necessarily prove that, it doesn't in itself say that, we know, or we've been passed down written record, photographic record, planting records of this vine being planted in 1921. And the fact that it's all MV6 and it all is very similar, and that's something I should have pointed out, obviously, the closer the dots are on this graph too, the more similar they are genetically. So the fact that they're all so close, and we have all these other records, suggest that it is the oldest single variety, single clone Pinot Noir vineyard in Australia. We're not claiming to have the oldest Pinot Noir vines in Australia. There are older. Something I didn't say before was those blocks where the material was taken from with Maurice O'Shea's 21 planting, both Irrawang and Kirkton no longer exist. So those vineyards are no longer in the ground, but there will have been an ancestral vine of which obviously our material has been taken from, and some other plantings in Australia which are older, though not a single clone, single vineyard. So, you know, with time that information will probably come out, but there are older Pinot Noir individual vines in Australia. And obviously there's a difference between a vineyard and a vine. One thing we can really be pretty certain on now too is that it is the birthplace of MV6. So that if through this work a range of different clones had been generated, or things that couldn't be identified would have thrown up more questions. The fact that all 12 were there, now look, that's 12 of 16,000 or 1,600 vines, but the fact that they were all, as a sample, MV6 and all very close MV6. And we know of Graham Gregory's selection work out of that block, taking cuttings from that block and then developing this clone. So we can say safely now that this block is the birthplace of MV6. There's questions with MV4 and MV5. I know a lot of some producers are saying that they have those cuttings, but there's no work yet to be done, or hasn't been done yet, to see if there's similarities between MV4, MV5 and MV6. And even Anthony today said they haven't had the chance to access that material. But is it the birthplace of those clones as well? Well, quite possibly. But one thing is for certain, and that is that we have an incredibly special old plot of Pinot Noir at Mount Pleasant. And as I've said here, the importance to it to the Australian wine industry cannot be overstated. So MV6, clone, isolated, propagated from material from Mount Pleasant. We still make a Mount Pleasant mother vine Pinot Noir. So fruit from that block goes on to make a wine that we make in our good years, where the fruit is of excellent quality. But Maurice didn't, at the start, use Pinot Noir as a standalone variety. He's famous for blending Pinot and Shiraz, and that's a Hunter River Burgundy is what it was referred to. It's a wine style from the Hunter, which has actually caught on in a lot of other regions now. So there's a lot of regions around Australia growing or making this Pinot Shiraz blend, but it originates in the Hunter and is a massive part of Maurice O'Shea's legacy as a winemaker, those blends. It was only until Brian Walsh, the second winemaker of the 5, of which Adrian's now the 5th, so there's only been 5 in the history. Brian was the first to make a standalone Pinot in 57. Phil Ryan, who was the 3rd winemaker, had made individual single Pinots as well, and Adrian is now continuing with that. So as I said, we are making a straight Pinot. And MV6, as I said earlier, it's the most planted clone in Australia of Pinot Noir. But what I found really interesting too in this research was to look at what wines is MV6 showing up in. So if you use the Langton's classification, which people could argue that's not a good guide, I'm going to use it for the sake of this presentation. If you use that as a guide to the great wines of Australia, every Pinot bar one on that list has MV6 either 100% of that wine or a great part of that. And that includes producers like Bass Phillip, which is considered an exceptional Pinot Noir, the #1 rated on Langton's classification. That's MV6. By far use MV6 in Geelong. Bindi have got 2 outstanding Pinots with MV6. Mount Mary is a famous vineyard in the Yarra Valley where MV6 plays a role. Giant Steps are a great Pinot Noir producer in the Yarra Valley. They use MV6. And the list goes on. Yabby Lake, Tolpuddle, Yarra Yering, Ashton Hills, Paringa Estate. There's many more, but MV6 is showing in all of those wines. So its role in Australian Pinot Noir, fine Pinot Noir, is huge. Sort of the last slide that I've put together is, and this was something that Sarah and Belinda both encouraged me to look at, which I've really enjoyed, is so through that information we have now, we can deduce it's an old planting, it's the birthplace of this clone. But where do we go? Where do we go from here? What do we do with this information? And as the name of the conference suggests, learning from the past, which we have, or which we are, which I certainly have by doing this project, and then building for the future. So there's a few ideas. I haven't listed them down. And look, I think they're all ideas that I'd like to look into and hopefully be able to present in the future to the Old Vine Conference on them, seeing how I go with them. But the reality is we have a clone now here in Australia, our unique Pinot Noir clone. Why has it become so successful in Australia? What is it about it? What happened in the time between 1832 and 1921 when Morris planted it? How did that vine, and how did that variety change in the face of the Hunter Valley conditions? The Hunter Valley, as I've noted before, is not a cool, easy growing area. It's a warm, humid. Sure, it may have been cooler back in 1921, but it still would have had warm summers, high UV, tricky humidity and summer rains. So what have those conditions played on that? As we know, genetics are only part of it. The environment plays a big part as well in terms of what comes out as a phenotype. So how has the environment and the time in the Hunter Valley generated this clone? You know, the reality is, with knowing that with MV6 being such a great wine making clone, what is it about it in the vineyard as well, which has been useful? And what do we think, you know, if we think about a warming climate, you know, this is a clone that has been generated in a warm climate and that's developed in a warm climate. These other countries that have been using Pinot Noir or growing Pinot Noir for many, many years, whether it be Burgundy or the south of New Zealand or Oregon, will there be interest in clones like MV6 due to the fact that it has that thicker skin, that droopy habit, these developments that have occurred in those conditions? Or what use could it be to the Pinot Noir industry going forward? I mean, there's a big push in Australia at the moment to plant alternative varieties in the face of a warming climate, or to look at disease resistance to lower our use of pesticides. But there's also something to say for retaining the varieties that we know and we love and that we grow, and looking for variations within those plantations, trying to find little intricacies that are out there in each of these vineyards that may be then, like Graham Gregory did back in the 60s, taken, propagated and sent out. I mean, there's potential for that as well. So as a clone, it has that potential. I think there's a lot of things we can go with this MV6 story. You know, it's got to this point. It's obviously so popular and has been so successful in Australia, but maybe its story is not done. And just finally, just some acknowledgements to finish up. So, of course, you got to look back to the past and thank James Busby and the other vinous pioneers of Australia who have established a great industry here. Morris O'Shea for setting up Mount Pleasant and planting the Pinot Noir vineyard, which we're lucky to work with. And then Graham Gregory for making that selection. In terms of the present, Prue for essentially kicking off this project and getting in touch with me and really making me realise what we had here at Mount Pleasant. Anthony for all his hard work and his team in terms of actually sequencing the genome and running me through what are fair and not fair assumptions to be made from this data. Phil Ryan, third winemaker in the history of Mount Pleasant. His knowledge has been fantastic. Adrian and Belinda, my colleagues at work, who have been encouraging the whole time. And Sarah and Belinda, of course, as well, for encouraging me to present. Some of the information I had from previous times growing in V6 in other regions, but I've also really weighed in on the Kirkton Wine Club and the Hungerford Associated Family Society. They had a lot of information about the history of the Hunter. Yalumba Nursery is a great source for all things viticulture, and then Wine Australia for some of the data in terms of Pinot Noir's planting. That's it for me. I hope it's made sense. Look, like I said, Mount Pleasant, this is one block amongst many that we have that are you know, really precious to the Australian wine industry, and there's many more projects to be done here. Thank you,
Nick. Thank you. Really great presentation. And I know I called you a geek, but you're a geek who knows how to communicate. And it's actually, you know, through my conversations with you that you got me onto this other aspect of the value of old vines, which is for like the intra-varietal diversity, so that it's not just that these are arcs of new or different or forgotten varieties, but it's also this intra-varietal and sort of population vineyards, as I believe they're called. And in fact, this was also a topic that came up yesterday from Laura Catena's presentation. And in fact, I've had an email from a South African currently working in France, Etienne Niesling, who was here yesterday, who I would love to put you in touch with, because he's actually working on intravarietal diversity research in France, for example. I mean, do you think there's enough attention in Australia being paid to this kind of research on intravarietal diversity?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Sarah. I mean, I said at the end, I think there's a lot of focus being put on a move towards other varieties or breeding in traits into the existing material, rather than sort of looking into what we have and being really specific. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these vineyards, when the season gets running, vineyard managers, viticulturists, owners probably aren't having the time or the chance to get into their blocks and pick out intricacies. Massive name drop, but Nick Farr, I remember talking to him from Geelong, very famous Pinot producer, and I spoke to him about disease resistance and alternative varieties, and he said by far his main thing was looking in his blocks and trying to find those clones or those plants that would seem to be adapting better to changing conditions or really taking on the site, to the point where they've started to now name their own clones, essentially from what they're seeing within their own blocks. So I don't think it is probably been looked at enough. Really, the last great propagation or clonal selection in Australia was the Graham Gregory run in the 60s. All of our other Pinot Noir in particular material has all come from Davis or Dijon, now Entave in France. So there needs to be, I think, a bit more time put into going into those established blocks and particularly old blocks and finding those individuals. Yeah.
And I know you mentioned Prue Henschke, who of course has been this enormously strong leader for vine improvement in Australia. Would something that came at me from your presentation is there's almost this sense that the MV6 is kind of Australian, it's sort of it's your Pinot Noir. Do you think that's important is that important to you? And do you think it's important for Australia to be able to sort of say, look, this is an almost adopted clone of Pinot Noir that's very, very much ours?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I just think the clone itself, I mean, it's that, you can pick it when you go into a vineyard with a range of clones. You can pick the MV6. It's just that thick skin. It looks gnarly. Even the canopy tends to be a little bit sort of messy, and it does handle the heat and the humidity reasonably well. But I think there's a real enjoyment in the fact that we have this clone that's our own. Other varieties, I'm not clear on whether there are those clones that are Australian that we feel really passionate about, but definitely MV6 is a really big story. And it has had some traction over the years. There's been a lot of wine journalists comment on it about its importance as a clone and as our own material. I think there's a bit of patriotism towards it. And it's just great that this vineyard is in the Hunter, which is, Australia's founding wine region. So I think it's been adapted. And then look, there are constantly people are looking into vineyard managers and vine improvement programs, and owners are looking into what else is out there. And Pinot's the clonal, is the nerdy variety for clonal selection. So people are always looking to having a greater complex mix, but I think the MV6 will always be a big part of the Great Australian Pinot. Yeah.
Got a question for you from Andrew Matthews. Do you cane or spur prune the MV6 Pinot? And what led to the choice of your pruning systems?
No, that's a good question. Yeah. So my colleague Belinda and I, when we all started around the same time in Mount Pleasant. And as I said, it's the main block as you drive in. It's very aesthetic. It's right there. And I probably think really that even before grasping the significance of the block, I think from an aesthetic point of view, it needed a bit of work. And it had been spur pruned for many, many years. And it was a really high spur, old cordon, as thick as the trunk, wired wrapped all the way through it, and it was choking it. There was a lot of dead material through those arms. So we've brought it back to cane. I've always think that cane for Pinot is pretty good. It regulates the crop nicely. It opens up the canopy a lot better too. And, the humid summers that we get here, you need that airflow and that sunlight penetration in the Hunter. So cane naturally opens up your canopy. And it moderates your production. I mean, a 1921 planting, we're not going to go for 20 tons a hectare. You know, we're quite happy with what we get off it. Also too, the only catch there is, rather than throwing new vines into that block, we're trying to layer off the existing vines as much as possible. So actually coming and bringing plant material shoots down from the previous season at pruning and continuing that. Therefore, we keep that genetic base in that block. Spurring's easier for that, in the sense of you're not taking the arm off so you can have a feeder shoot come off and continue. Caning, we're actually trialing this year about taking a shoot further down from the actual crown, so maybe mid trunk or even a sucker, and using that as a layer. So that way we can continue to cane prune, but also be able to develop and fill in gaps off the trunk.
Amazing. Thank you. I mean, Nick, you're so well informed and so fascinating to listen to. We could, I know, go on for a while, but we have to move on to our next session. But I just wanted to thank you for your great support. You've been a very early and stalwart supporter of the Old Vine Conference. Thank you for this presentation. I think there's a lot of interest in this project and where you're going to go next with it. And I should just say the wines are absolutely delicious, people. So try and get hold of them. And yeah, Nick, thank you, and look forward to keeping in touch. And we'll forward the questions and requests.
Absolutely.
I think,
yeah, look, if anyone wants to get in touch, that's no problem. Sarah, thank you for your hard work too, and Belinda's as well, of highlighting these old vine producers. And like I said, half of our vineyard area is considered old in my eyes, and you know, we look forward to working with you guys from now on constantly. So very good. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Nick. All the best.
No problem. See ya.
See you.